Episode 23, titled Frame Organizational Risk Using Recognized Standards, we open by treating standards as the scaffolding that keeps risk language sturdy, plumb, and usable. Teams bring different dialects to the table: engineering shorthand, legal nuance, finance metrics, and without a shared frame, the conversation frays quickly. A standard gives us the posts and beams, common terms, agreed steps, and repeatable outputs that stand up under scrutiny. With that structure in place, risk stops being an abstract worry and becomes something a leadership team can weigh, compare, and act on with confidence. Two practical frames guide most enterprises today: ISO 31000 and NIST 800-30. Both establish a straight-line flow from understanding context to choosing treatment, even if their vocabulary differs around the edges. In essence, you clarify the environment and objectives, identify and analyze risk scenarios, evaluate them against criteria that the organization accepts, and then choose a response that reduces, transfers, avoids, or accepts the exposure. SIO 31000 emphasizes principles and governance, while NIST 800-30 provides hands-on mechanics for identifying threats, vulnerabilities, likelihood, and impact. Used together, they help you explain why a scenario matters, how big it is in meaningful units, and what to do next without hand-waving. Clear vocabulary is the hinge that lets that door swing freely. A risk arises when a threat can act on a vulnerability to harm an asset, with a likelihood of occurrence and an impact if it happens. Asset simply means something of value: data, systems, services, people, or reputation. Threat refers to an actor or event with motive and capability, while vulnerability is a weakness or condition that makes harm feasible. Likelihood describes the chance of occurrence within a defined time window. Impact captures the consequences in money, time, safety, compliance, or mission terms. Write each element in plain, testable wording that a reviewer can verify from logs, inventories, and records, not in euphemisms that collapse on contact with evidence. To get decision-ready, risk statements benefit from a cause, event, effect structure that leaves little room for ambiguity. The cause names the weakness or condition. The event describes the specific harmful action. The effect states the consequence in concrete terms that matter to the organization. Because externally facing SSO tokens are valid for 8 hours after logout, an attacker using stolen tokens can access payroll services, leading to unauthorized wage changes and regulatory breach notifications. Is not poetry, but it is testable and traceable. By naming the cause, you point to where a control might help. By naming the event, you scope likelihood with threat evidence. By naming the effect, you tie the outcome to business language that finance and legal already understand. With the structure of a statement in place, you can cleanly distinguish inherent and residual risk. Inherent risk is the level that exists before considering the effect of controls, given the assets, threats, and vulnerabilities in play. Residual risk is the level that remains after controls are applied and operating as designed. Some controls primarily reduce likelihood by limiting opportunities or attack surface. Think stronger authentication or tighter network segmentation. Others primarily reduce impact by containing blast radius or accelerating recovery. Think backups, immutability, or rapid isolation. Many do a bit of both. Good analysis says which dimension moves, by how much, and on what evidence, rather than assuming every new tool magically cures everything. Scales for likelihood and impact need calibration with anchors that mean the same thing to everyone. If likely means more than once per quarter to one reader and once every 3 years to another, your colors and ranks will mislead. Anchor likelihood bands to observed or modeled frequencies within a defined time horizon, citing telemetry, incident records, or industry baselines where available. Anchor impact to financial loss bands, service downtime thresholds, and regulatory or contractual exposure cut points. For example, statutory breach notification triggers, safety incident severity definitions, or customer SLA penalties. Write the anchors into your methodology so a new analyst would choose the same score if handed the same evidence. Not every decision warrants the same analytic horsepower, which is why qualitative, semi-quantitative, and quantitative approaches all have a home. Qualitative approaches use calibrated words and well-anchored scales to compare options quickly. They are sufficient when stakes are modest, time is short, or data is thin. Semi-quantitative approaches convert anchored categories into numbers to support sorting and thresholding, accepting that the numbers are bins with labels, not measurements with significant digits. Quantitative approaches model frequencies and loss distributions directly, usually in currency terms, and shine when a decision hinges on trade-offs that leadership must justify in budget language. The art is matching method to materiality so analysis clarifies rather than obscures. Factor analysis of information risk, spelled FAIR on first mention and FAIR thereafter, offers a concise, quantitative lens when precision around loss matters to the choice. FAIR decomposes a scenario into loss event frequency and probable loss magnitude, then further into drivers such as threat event frequency, vulnerability as probability of action success, and primary and secondary losses. The benefit is a model that forces each assumption into the light, where evidence can support it or push it down. While FAIR takes discipline and some data curation, it repays the effort when questions center on insurance limits, control investment sizing, or the break-even point between two mitigation strategies. Use it selectively where dollars decide. A risk register converts analysis into governance by assigning stewardship, time, and accountability. Each entry should capture the scenario statement, current inherent and residual levels with their rationale, the chosen treatment, the control actions linked to that treatment, the single accountable owner, and a realistic due date. Status fields should reflect milestones that can be evidenced: control design approved, change ticket implemented, test results recorded, validation completed. When the register is living rather than decorative, leadership can see trend lines, unblock dependencies, and defend choices at audit time. The register also becomes a learning archive, showing which controls moved which risks and by how much across quarters and years. Dependencies deserve explicit mapping because controls seldom act in isolation. Multi-factor authentication does more than protect one application. It reduces attacker success across many lateral movement paths and privilege escalation attempts. Endpoint isolation capacity helps ransomware, insider sabotage, and data loss response at once. When you visualize relationships among assets, controls, and scenarios, you can trace how a single investment lowers multiple entries in the register and avoid treating each risk as a solitary island. This mapping also reveals hidden single points of failure where one neglected control props up a misleadingly low set of residual ratings. Common anti-patterns creep into well-meaning programs and quietly hollow them out. Heat map theater substitutes colorful squares for calibrated criteria, especially when category labels are undefined or mutable at meeting time. Copy-paste risks keep stale language alive long after assets, threats, and controls have changed, leading to phantom urgencies and missed realities. Undefined or inconsistent scales let teams argue their way to preferred colors rather than follow evidence to a defensible position. The remedy is boring but effective. Define scales with anchors, time-box their review, keep risk statements tied to specific causes and effects, and require that each residual change cite the control evidence that justifies the movement. Consider a brief scenario that moves from vague to decision-ready. The vague version reads, "We might get hacked, causing downtime." That phrasing leaves every lever undefined, so debate drifts toward anecdotes. A clearer statement becomes, "Because external payroll SSO tokens remain valid for 8 hours after logout and session revocation is not propagated across providers, an attacker with a stolen token can modify wage data for up to 1 business day, resulting in an estimated $100,000 in rework, penalties, and customer notifications. Now you can test the token behavior, estimate frequency from token theft telemetry and intel, and size impact using finance and compliance input. Controls such as short-lived tokens and revocation propagation can be modeled to reduce likelihood and effect with evidence. To turn that into metrics, specify bands and references. Suppose incident data and red team results indicate 3 to 5 token theft successes per year absent additional controls, with a per-event loss magnitude centered at $100,000 and a tail to $300,000 in adverse regulatory cases. Calibrated likelihood becomes several per year, and impact sits in the 6-figure direct cost plus notification and reputational exposure band, anchored to compliance thresholds. If adopting token binding and revocation propagation is expected to cut success probability by 80% based on vendor trials and internal pilots, your residual estimates shift accordingly. Decision makers can then compare the control cost against expected loss reduction without hand-waving. Before moving on, reinforce the vocabulary and the sequence set by the chosen standard. In ISO 31000 terms, you start with principles and context, then move through risk assessment, identification, analysis, evaluation, and into treatment and continuous monitoring. In NIST 830 terms, you scope, identify threats and vulnerabilities, determine likelihood and impact, and characterize risk with documentation that supports decisions and follow-up. Across both, the recurring cues remain stable: state, cause, event, effect. Anchor scales show inherent versus residual with evidence, and link treatments to owners and dates. When those cues are audible in every entry, the program's voice becomes steady enough for stakeholders to trust. One more sanity check ties back to governance cadence. A register that grows but never closes teaches the wrong lesson, so status definitions must be real. Mitigation in progress should correspond to approved designs and change tickets in flight. Implemented should have validation artifacts and sign-offs. Verified effective should point to monitoring results or test evidence. Review meetings should prioritize items where residual movement is promised but not yet evidenced, or where promised controls depend on upstream architecture changes. This discipline keeps language honest and outcomes measurable, which is the quiet heartbeat of credible risk management. The role of culture is easy to overlook while discussing structures and models, yet it determines whether the scaffolding holds. Analysts who write in plain language, product owners who accept evidence-based adjustments to roadmaps, and leaders who tolerate the discomfort of quantified trade-offs make the system work. Standards do not replace judgment, they channel it. When you frame each scenario in terms that an engineer, a lawyer, and a finance director can all read without translation, you create the conditions for timely choices and fewer surprises. That is the practical payoff of recognized standards. As you mature the practice, expect methods to coexist rather than compete. Use qualitative analysis to triage and to engage teams in steady conversation, because momentum matters. Bring semi-quantitative scoring to portfolio sorting, because budgets require thresholding and alignment. Reserve FAIR and other quantitative tools for the short list of decisions where insurance, architecture, or control spend turns on expected loss curves, because those are the places where a dollar of analytic effort saves many more. The common thread is traceability, from scenario to scales, from controls to residual change, from evidence to decisions. In closing, this episode's title is not a slogan, it is a work pattern. Frame risks using standards so the language stays consistent, the scales stay anchored, and the registers stay actionable. Draft 3 decision-ready scenarios that matter now, each with a single owner and a due date, and capture them with inherent and residual estimates supported by evidence. As those move through treatment and verification, refine your anchors and update your dependencies, keeping the scaffolding strong enough to carry the next round of choices without wobble. The outcome is a program that can explain itself, calmly, plainly, and on paper whenever it counts. Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.